welcome along to the Property Academy podcast by Opus Partners. I'm your host, Stephen Knight. And so the show we're questioning, is the war on inflation over? Because economists were shocked at the most recent inflation numbers. So we're going to talk about what it means for you in your property investment portfolio and what's going to happen to interest rates. But before we get into that, Andrew, what did the new data show?
Just as a refresher, inflation is how quickly the cost of living is going up for everyone. And there's a whole lot of negative things that occur with that. And we've actually done previous podcasts on that, haven't we?
Oh, of course we have. We've got higher interest rates because of inflation. Most people have less money to be able to top up their investment properties. And on top of that, it can lead to lower growth.
Now, inflation has come down in the last quarter to 6.7, down from 7.2 in the previous quarter. So it's the lowest it has been since the end of 2021.
That's right. Back in March 22, it was about 6.9%. Since then, it went up to about 7.2. Now we've finally dropped below that 7% again.
Yeah, so we've been hovering above that 7% mark. To get below that is great, and it is a lot lower than what the banks were predicting.
Well, that's actually the really good news. The good news isn't just that it's 6.7% and it's coming down, because, of course, 6.7% is still really, really hot. What matters is how the inflation data compared to economists' predictions. So if I look at what the Reserve Bank thought that the inflation data was going to be, they thought it was going to be 7.3%. ANZ and ASB, they thought 7.2%. BNZ KiwiBank about 7.1 and Westpac 6.9. The fact that the real inflation data, or the inflation data that was most recently released, came in at 6.7%. Hey, that is really good news. Now, Andrew, walk us through, why does that actually matter in terms of what somebody's property or mortgage interest rate is going to be?
Well, if you think back to September last year, inflation came out at 7.2. Now, that was down from the previous quarter, but it was above where everyone expected it to land. And so as a result, interest rates jumped up immediately. We saw quite a big percentage increase at that stage. Well, how much was it?
It was about 1%. And actually, one of the main things that impact interest rates are your swap rates. So this is what it costs a bank to borrow money and then lend it out to you. And if you look at what happened when that data came out early September, we jumped from about 4.14% all the way up to 5.2%. So the 1 year swap rate jumped in about a month by 1 percentage point. So if it costs the banks more money to lend you and I money for our mortgages, that's where they're going to ramp up interest rates. Now, over that period, we actually didn't see the OCR increase, but we expected that the Reserve Bank would take a much harder line, and because of that, that's why we saw wholesale markets moved. That's why we saw the wholesale interest rate jump by a percentage point, which flowed through into our mortgage interest rates.
And of course, the reason that we had higher interest rates right then, even though the OCR hadn't gone up, is because there was an expectation that we would see the OCR go up. And that's exactly what we saw. At their next monetary policy, Adrian Orr ramped up the OCR, and then we didn't see much of a change in the interest rates because it had already been priced in.
Yeah, that's when I texted him to break up with him. I was very upset. So with all of this, I think you've got a question. Well, what's going to happen now? When we had inflation come in much higher than expected, we saw interest rates ramp up.
Well, obviously they'll come down drastically over the next wee while, right?
No. But I think that we will likely see some amount of softening because we have seen inflation come in on the low side now. So it's not necessarily that the Reserve Bank's going to come out and say, now we can bring the OCR down, inflation's coming down. What they'll likely say is,
it's working.
What we're doing is working. Perhaps we can maintain the current setting or increase it by, say, 0.25% at the next time, but that will likely be the last increase in the OCR in this interest rate cycle, because we're starting to see that the current monetary policy settings are starting to work.
And actually, there was a comment in the last monetary policy statement that you quoted where Adrian Orr was saying this is the interest rate that we need to be at. These are the actual interest rates. That's why we're increasing the OCR to maintain those current interest rates, right?
Yes, and that's because of exactly the same thing we said before. You can have wholesale markets move because they expect the OCR to do something, or the Reserve Bank to do something, and then the Reserve Bank actually has to do it, otherwise we'll see them crashing down. Now, one thing that's interesting, and I'll zoom in on this for anybody watching on the YouTube, if we look at what happened after that inflation data came out on the 20th of April, we did see a decrease in the one-year wholesale rate, but it was only by a very small amount. You know, if we look at some other periods, you could see the interest rates moving much more quickly and much more aggressively. The inflation data didn't have that much of an impact on the short-term wholesale interest rates. It did for the longer-term rates, but not for the short-term ones quite as much.
And do you think that's because the expectation was it was going to go down, and it's gone down, but it's gone down a little bit more than expected, but again, it's kind of about the direction, right?
But not by a dramatic amount. I think that's the difference. If we look at something like, I was looking at the 3-year wholesale rate, and again, this matters because this is what the banks borrow to then lend to you. And again, we do see it decreasing by a little bit, but it's not by a huge amount. So I don't expect interest rates to come down straight away. And part of that is what we're going to get into, which is, well, how is the inflation actually made up? But before we get into that, where will inflation go next?
So while banks and economists will never get the numbers exactly right, it's about the direction or the trend, getting that part of it right. And so again, we're going to head down with inflation, but it's going to take some time to get to that acceptable band for the Reserve Bank. So they're kind of predicting that early next year, end of this year, right?
That's correct. So if we look at all of the banks' predictions about what they think is going to happen in inflation, and we put them on a graph, we can see that on average, banks, financial institutions, Treasury, Reserve Bank, they expect that we're going to be back within that band by about June next year, June 2024, and the average bank thinks it's going to be about 2.8%. But the most pessimistic bank...
Is it Westpac?
I don't actually know. It's not on my graph in this one. They don't think it's going to happen till a year later in June 2025. And in fact, the most optimistic thinks we're going to be back within the band by mid to late this year, 2023.
The difference?
Well, it just goes to show that you can have different institutions, different banks. They're going to have different forecasts. But if you take the average, I think that's or the wisdom of crowds of bank economists, that's probably going to give us a really good sense of when we're going to start to see inflation really ease. And they're predicting that it's going to come from about 6.7% all the way down to perhaps 4% by the end of the year. Now, if banks are correct in this, that's where the Reserve Bank can start slacking off a little bit in terms of what they're doing with the OCR. And if that happens, that's where we're going to start to see interest rates come down. Now, bear in mind, it's going to be slow, because the Reserve Bank doesn't want interest rates to come down too quickly, and then we all go and we start spending again. So our interest rate prediction is still that we could still hit a 7% one-year interest rate in 2023. But on average next year, we think we're going to get to about 6% for the one-year mortgage interest rate. And if we start to see these kinds of inflation numbers that we see here that banks are predicting, somewhere between 2 to 3.5%, I feel pretty confident that we'll get down to about that 6%. Now, what's really important to note too is it doesn't mean that this is all good news. It doesn't mean that absolutely everything within the data release made us happy. So we've got to consider how is inflation being made up. And there are really two types of inflation. We've got imported inflation and we've got domestic inflation. Now, imported inflation is if the cost of building things over in China becomes more expensive, they have to charge us more for the dishwashers and the dryers and whatever we import from China. But the Reserve Bank cannot control what sort of inflation or how quickly prices are increasing over in China. They've got no ability to do that. Same if we're importing a lot of stuff from the UK or the European Union. If prices are going up there and we're importing that stuff, that could mean that prices here are rising too. But again, we can't control that. So what the Reserve Bank really wants to look at is what's happening with domestic inflation. Now, if you read the papers, they call this tradable and non-tradable inflation. Tradable inflation is imported, non-tradable is domestic, but I just like to keep things simple. Now, the concerning thing from the most recent data release is that imported inflation came down by a lot. It decreased by 1.8 percentage points, down from 8.2 to 6.4. And actually, domestic inflation, what the Reserve Bank can control, increased by 0.2% from 6.6 to 6.8%. Now, Adrian Orr is not going to like that because he could question, am I really getting the impact that I want from my interest rate rises? That's why I think we could still see an OCR increase in the next monetary policy decision.
So another way of saying that is overseas is costing us less, but here it's costing us more and we're still spending more.
That's exactly what we're starting to see in this specific number. So one thing that I expect to see is some commentary from this around the Reserve Bank. The next time they come out, they do their press release, they tell us what they're going to do with the official cash rate. I expect they're going to be targeting domestic inflation. But just because that's the case, I don't think we should be upset overall with the data release. The fact that inflation is coming well under what Reserve Bank, Treasury and many economists predicted, I think that's a really good thing. And it does give us more confidence that these forecasts about where might we get with inflation and this idea that inflation is going to come down or is likely to come down quite rapidly, it gives us more confidence that those forecasts may be correct. And I think, Andrew, you've got to be quite careful with some of the news headlines you read at the moment as well, right?
Yeah, so inflation at the moment, 6.7%, but that's overall. So food price inflation is huge at the moment. And in fact, fruit and vegetable increases of around 12 to 20%.
Yeah, I think it's 20% over the last 2 years I've seen food inflation at.
That's outrageous.
Yeah, quite enormous. Have you tried to go buy an avocado recently? They're out the gate.
How much is an avocado now?
I'm pretty sure I saw $6 the other day.
Oh, yeah. That is pretty expensive.
Yeah, I think there was a new
You
world.
don't want to have a Mexican party at your house anytime soon.
Well, no, if you go and buy guacamole off the shelf, though, it's actually cheaper.
Ew, who buys that?
Probably a significant number of people listening to this show.
I'm sorry to you for that comment then.
Yeah, you do need to apologise. You're about to get cancelled. Okay, so we see headlines that says food inflation up 12, 20%. What's your point?
So my point is that you've actually got to be careful when you're reading these headlines because it's not all roses at the moment.
Well, I think the real point you're trying to make is that sometimes you can see scary news headlines where you see food prices up 12% and you think, oh my God, inflation's never going to come down. But there are a lot of things that we buy that have not gone up by 6.7%. There are some that are increasing by 1, 2, 3%. Some are even decreasing in price. The average is what we really care about. And while there are a lot of political parties, and I see them posting at the moment, trying to make this inflation number 6.7%, it's a really bad thing. I think we should look at this and actually say, this is a really good thing right now compared to what we expected to be the case, and we are now starting to move in the right direction. So I think you just have to be careful about some of the sentiment that you do see online and in news stories because this is something to be celebrated. Right, let's wrap it up there. But I tell you what, one thing you could do to help us grow the show is share this with a friend. So if you've got somebody who's interested or worried about inflation, thinking about what does this mean for my mortgage interest rate that I'm paying, then it might be a good idea to share this with them so they get the same information that you're getting, and that also helps us grow the show. Of course, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. It really does help us get the message out to more people. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Steve McKnight. We're going to be back here tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the property market. Until next time.